DeFi Slate team.
Hey, what's up, guys? It's Andrew here, or Andy, as you know it. I'd love for you, if you enjoyed this content, if you got something out of it, to give it a like, subscribe to our channel on YouTube. We're really trying to grow it here, and we'd really appreciate it. Cheers, guys, and I hope you enjoyed.
What's up, guys? I'm here with Joseph Weinberg from Shift. Joseph is a Bitcoin OG. I would call him a crypto punk. I'm not sure that he'd call himself that, but we are here today with Joseph, an entrepreneur in the industry, and he's building a really interesting platform called Shift Network. I'll kind of let him explain what he's doing and where he got to this point. I mean, everybody wants to know kind of how you got into crypto, whether you bought the top in 2017 or you were in the ETH Genesis, or, so talk to us a bit about how you got here and what you're all about, and then we'll hop right in, man.
Absolutely. Yeah. And thanks for having me. So got my start in crypto, kind of out of discovery. It was late 2010, actually. So very, very early. I was in a computer science class in Canada, in Vancouver. One thing led to another, and we were working on a project. And one of my classmates had found this thing called, on SourceForge actually, called Bitcoin. And, we tried to utilize some of the P2P network libraries, and it was so early. And as we kind of looked at it, we're like, oh, this thing is weird. Like, what is the Bitcoins? Like, what is this thing? And so one thing led to another. And, at the end of December, when kind of final exams were done, we kept running, and just like mining as like three guys. And so did that for about a year. Stopped. I actually moved to the Peruvian Amazon, and so lived with a tribe of natives in the jungle. And that's actually where like this idea of like, we in like the Western world don't realize like, how easy and how good we've got it. Anyways, fast forward 2013. I moved to Toronto in Canada, worked at one of the largest mobile application development companies, left as the big Bitcoin first, wave really started to move. I was like, wow, I have like a ton of these Bitcoins, like, and then ever since then been actively in the space. So I've been working on a few exchanges early on. So I worked at an exchange called CoinSetter, really started a lot of the early Canadian kind of cryptocurrency or Bitcoin movement. Was there in the early days of the Ethereum co-founding at Decentral with Anthony Diorio and everyone. And that was like a really amazing time in the space. It was like very nascent. It was just a group of, it wasn't about finance or money or any of these things. It was much more about concepts and ideas and just, finding this small community. And we could talk for hours on the early days there. And then over the last kind of 5-6 years, been working on a variety of different businesses. CoinSetter was acquired by Kraken in early 2016, and then went on to build another company called Paycase Financial, and really looked at kind of like the areas that we viewed to be the most important for the next billion people, or the first billion people to come into the space. And so over the last kind of 4 or 5 years, I've been working on a variety of areas. Really focused on the policy side on one side, making sure we keep crypto, safe from regulatory, overreach, I would say, in one concept, in one area. And then early 2017, we started building Shift, which we can kind of talk about. We're really with this belief that, as we go through this co-integration with the wider worlds, and this kind of institutional or more traditional adoption occurs, there'll be a lot of infrastructure that's required that kind of bridges the gap between totally decentralized, permissionless DeFi, and just, decentralized, infrastructure, and the world that we live in today. So I've been working in kind of variety of areas, not, the traditional Bitcoiner route, more focused on the broad ecosystem and its implications, and how you help people, and more so as opposed to any one side, I would say. So that's kind of a short breakdown.
Nice. So you wouldn't classify yourself as a maxi?
I think I would look at myself as more of a generalist. Like, I've always been interested in the space because I believe that like there's a lot of problems that the world has, and it's like, however we can affect change is what matters to me. I think Bitcoin is incredibly good at certain things. And to be honest, like, when I look at Bitcoin, I think it has some of the brightest minds on the planet working on a use case or set of them that is important. I'm a maxi when it comes to Bitcoin for the purpose of Bitcoin, right? But like, I just fundamentally think that like we have so many problems in the world to solve, and different things solve different problems. And like, I'm a maxi in all things crypto, let's put it that way.
Yeah, I'm actually on change and kind of implementing the ideologies that I think the industry can equally share. It doesn't matter if it's Ethereum or Bitcoin or, I mean, I guess if it's Ripple, it kind of does matter because, I mean,
Yeah,
but
that'll make an exception with, but
we'll get there. But yeah, I think that you were touching on the concept of kind of like this idea of bringing the crypto space and like intertwining it with like almost the real world, because
yeah,
right now it's like we kind of exist in a bubble of our own tech, our own little people, our own little space, our little monies. It's kind of like how it's viewed almost, and that's how it is, right? There's no I mean, there is real integration happening, but there's still no real life aspect to it. Almost, it feels like it feels so underground, right? And so that concept of being able to bring, I mean, that's ultimately probably the most important thing that the crypto industry needs, is that idea of bringing it to the real world and being able to mesh. But there's so many problems with the ideologies of how some people feel of like what crypto should be. I think you've got like the bankless people where it's like fully decentralized, anonymous, like power to the people. And then you've got like people that are kind of trying to like recreate our system as it is, just using crypto. So like, can you speak to kind of what you've seen in your experience on those two sides? And,
And so Anthony Pompliano said it so well. He's like, Joe, it's basically like you created the Wild Wild West, and I was born in like the Wild Wild West, and then I looked around and said, in order to make this actually work, like I got to come back to the other side here, right? And like kind of balance the view. And I think that's exactly the case, right? Like I think ultimately like this comes down to choice, right? And like the early parts of the space, right? And this happens in every adoptive cycle. The early days of Bitcoin was lawless, wild, wild west, freedom and everything. And there was only one option as it pertained to, accessibility in Bitcoin. And the people that, initially created that are in that same characteristics: privacy first, total like anonymity. That's the same with, a set of, the Ethereum ecosystem as well, right? And I think that like those are the initial points, but like my view is that like, in order to build choice, you have to start building things that make those trade-offs, right? And I think that that's the big thing, right? Like my belief is that like it's not that Bitcoin is anonymous. It's not that Ethereum is anonymous, right? Like it's pseudo anonymity for a reason, right? Like you start with this idea of anonymity, and then our ability to build trade-offs is the choice of people. And that's what makes our ecosystem so powerful, is to provide more choice. Right. And so the more that we can provide options across the board, the more we can appeal to different, people and different types of groups. And I think that that's like the core thing here, right? Is like we start at privacy or a level of privacy and allow us to say, listen, institutions, they will not be able to trade, anon coins all day. It's just not the way that they're structured, right? And that's okay. That is totally okay, right? But like the idea that there will always be these different options for people, that's what I think is like freedom is about. And that's like what I believe in the space, is like we're providing a new set of class of options around freedom. And so from there, the question is like, how do you start, building these different building blocks, right? And how do you make those trade-offs, and what are the trade-offs, and what do they mean? And everyone might, some people want full privacy and anonymity, and the ecosystem will always continue to provide that. But I just think that the mass adoptive crowd, like, it's a tough, that just doesn't work in the context of how the world works today. So
I think it's key though for the different parties to have the ability to have those options, like be able to be the private, be able to, because some people just want to hold their funds on Coinbase or Kraken and just let it ride, and not have to worry about everything else. But there's other people who are trying to use all sorts of privacy coins, of mixers, of anonymous emails and addresses, and all sorts of different things. And it kind of comes back into what we were touching on prior to Toponologist, just like the different rules and regulations in different areas. They incentivize a a vast array of different actions by the people who live in those areas. So
Definitely.
there might be a person who feels a certain way in the States who acts in a different way than a different person who feels the exact same way, but say in, you know, a country like Estonia, for example, right?
Yep.
So when there's different rules and regulation, that also affects how people act, you know, kind of in a sense of like, okay, it doesn't matter how I feel, but this is how it is, and so I have to kind of act,
Yes.
you know, on that. So how does Shift fit into this area of, okay, how can we mix and kind of bring together a bridge of, okay, this kind of crypto punk idea and the real world and
Yep.
institutions and banking and finance? Where does Shift fit in there?
Yeah, and so like I mean, there's like a few things that we have like learned along the way, right? Like cold storage came out of, or at least like call it, you know, Coinbase storage came out of this realization that like users were lazy, right? Like Quadriga, all of these like failed exchanges were like you know, a lesson in a lot of lessons learned, right? And on behalf of the ecosystem, right? And like it all comes down to this user experience question. So like, you know, as it pertained to how regulations are formatting, you know, we always thought like, oh, everyone, you know, wants the privacy and everything else. And then we realized like, actually, no, like people kind of get lazy. And so like you see where regulations make sense in some capacity. Like no one wants a rug pull on, you know, hundreds of millions of dollars that are sitting in a certain exchange, right? And so like there's always these like interesting realizations that like, you know, we go through. And I think it's largely a learning experience for the ecosystem. And I think that like regulations do play a role in some capacity. But again, it's all about that choices we've been talking about. And so kind of like getting to Shift, the precursor was that we were doing a lot of work with regulators in Canada and around the world, realizing like about 4 years ago, oh my God, like once crypto gets to a certain level, as it, you know, started to gain a lot of prevalence, like the earliest guys in the space weren't doing enough, and I'd still argue that largely they aren't today, in doing enough to properly interface with regulators, right? And so like, you know, if we're not the ones to educate on what is and isn't DeFi and what is and isn't, you know, privacy and what is and isn't a risk, then who's going to do it? And the outcome becomes we're improperly regulating, we're putting in things that don't make sense where they shouldn't, and it kills innovation and it kills the openness of our ecosystem, right? And this is what we kind of took it on ourselves and said, this is going to be a huge issue. We need to get policy right. We need to get regulation right. The other side of that, though, is that we also realized that there was some really important infrastructure that needed to be in place such that when regulators come, you know, knocking at our doors or coming, you know, to the ecosystem, that we can actually build systems from within our space that would actually reconfigure how regulation works, right? Regulations, just for everyone, like are meant to centralize a lot of things. Like if you think about compliance, like we hold and store identity and KYC information in these like honeypots, right? And traditionally, that's what happens in banks and in financial institutions, et cetera, right? And it's designed, compliance is designed to centralize these functions, right? But crypto doesn't work that way, right? And if we want to actually achieve, you know, what, you know, decentralization, you know, it's calling for, and more privacy, like these things kind of work in contrast. And so what we kind of realized was that there were a set of like primitives that we needed to start developing that once the rubber kind of met the road, that we could start to solve some of these issues on chain, right? So Shift is kind of a multitude of infrastructures, I would say. It was designed as an attestation based kind of layer. So the idea that we could build a representation system in many ways. The idea that we could build an identity system on one side that could really attest to the validity of certain types of information. That's like at the core basis of it. How do you represent that into what use cases? The question for us was really around like, what does KYC look like in the traditional world? And more so, if we were to start seeing regulations like SWIFT becoming a requirement in crypto, well, Bitcoin doesn't work the way that financial institutions work, right? Like it creates these huge problems in counterparty trust and just how configuration works. And so what we recognize is that we needed to look at how do you build discovery layers? How do you actually build new systems of discovery and counterparty validation using public protocols and using smart contracts as a way to enable identity, enable users and or exchanges and or companies to represent themselves on top of networks, and ultimately define the rules, the roles, and the permissioning that could be generalized enough to allow for country regulations to be embedded, to allow for user privacy reconfigurations to be enabled, and to ultimately provide user consent back at the protocol level to allow systems and companies to all work in almost like a regulatory layer or an opt-in compliance layer on top of any type of protocol. And so that's kind of what we had recognized was like, there will come this time where, really simply put, a global whitelist is needed, right? Like, think of how whitelists work in smart contracts today, right? Like the idea that we can have this opt-in compliance layer, this fabric, solves for the problems that regulators have, but we don't like to look at it as the negative. We like to look at it more as like, if I can opt into a new compliance system, I can also enable use cases that don't exist today, right? New types of credit formation, new types of lending systems, new types of compliant asset liquidity pool environments. You can start really actually enabling new types of systems that actually look towards a broader audience that today have a hard time dealing in the wild west of crypto,
Right.
as we like to call it, if that makes sense. I know it's a lot to unpack, but
yeah.
But yeah, and that's really what the vision is like, how do you build something that everyone can utilize when they need to give that other option to those that right now aren't able to play in the space.
Right. Because, I mean, at the end of the day, the protocols that we have now for usage in DeFi, anybody can use them.
Yeah.
Anybody can go on there with absolutely none of this that you speak of. Like, there's nothing. You can just log in and you're good to go.
Yep.
But the moment that people start getting to the point where it's either they're losing money, so there's hacks, or there's prices that are going down a lot, or I would say more on like the hack side, or B, any sort of regulator makes one move, everything goes kind of up in flames a lot quicker than it should. Whereas basically what we're getting at here is, okay, so if we can avoid that by basically beating the regulators to the punch, by kind of having a happy middle for what the CryptoPunk, anonymous, privacy, and bankless gods want, and what the Chad of the finance world wants, right? Like how can we allow these two minds to kind of like collab? And that's what I'm seeing. Because I mean, it's gonna come down to it. Like within the next 12 months, I would say there's gotta be some pretty serious hits on these protocols that are only on smart contracts and completely global and permissionless. Like, for example, on the Uniswap call last night, it was a governance call, and the Uniswap team hops on, right? But they can't answer any questions. They can't do anything, because really what they're allowing is the transfer of assets anywhere, anytime, with no KYC, and hell, they could also be securities.
There's a reason why Satoshi is a concept. That's right. That's
and anonymous and a concept.
Exactly.
Right. Yeah.
Right.
So
and
that's so crazy. So the regulatory arbitrage concept is huge, and that's kind of what contributes to a lot of like the profit opportunities, is that that's not really there elsewhere.
And I mean, like, I can kind of like add to that. Like, I think that there's a lot, as like going on the lesson track, like, early on we thought we were untouchable. There's nothing that can shake Bitcoin, and everything. And what we found out over the last 2 years was that like actually regulators can do a lot. Even, Bitcoin or Ethereum, they don't care about regulators. They have no opinion on it. They will continue to move forward. But like, we as people actually are, bound by the rocks we sit on and the laws that confine us, right? And like, that's a very different concept, and it's the same that goes for our companies, right? We've just learned this the hard way with exchanges, is that like, we're going through this re-implementation of SWIFT effectively by regulators globally. So the Financial Action Task Force is requiring all of the CeFi exchanges now to effectively transmit our identity information, right? And so Shift acts as this really great counterparty discovery and identity identity system and compliance primitive system to enable that to happen with users being in control of their data. But like, to kind of take it a step further, like, there will be this reckoning. Like, we are not untouchable, and like, you know, governance only goes so far, as you're saying, right? Like,
Yeah.
there will be, and like, policy right now, like, people in policy are asking us as advisors, what do we do with DeFi? Like, there are inherent risks in the way the world thinks of risks inherent in DeFi, and like, there is like a reckoning coming. Our philosophy is the only way to stop regulations from being written is to show them that we can build infrastructure that solves the problem without them having to regulate, right? Like, that is like our biggest thing, because like, the exchanges are going through a very challenging situation, but if we can avoid that in P2P and in, you know, DeFi and smart contract based systems, like, we can build a much better future. And like, I would argue too, as like a last point on this, or on this piece, is like, we think that crypto is big and there's a lot of liquidity because of no friction. Imagine the amount of liquidity and growth crypto has when like, you have basic, you know, compliance, somewhat related systems implemented. Like, the amount of liquidity that sits in the real world is orders of magnitude, right? Like, you know, the growth and adoption comes from that co-integration, right? And so if we can make it safe for ourselves, also avoid our own risks, hopefully make the ecosystem better, and also enable new opportunities, I think that that's a net win for everyone. And we still have the option of privacy, right? Like, it's not force people into these identity systems or compliance. It's give people the option to choose, right? So I think that's the big piece. So
yeah, and I mean, ultimately, the thing is that the smart contracts, they're never going to stop, and the miners on Bitcoin are never going to stop mining. So like, those systems are going full steam ahead regardless, as you said. So it's almost like, and I've never thought of it in this light. So I do appreciate this kind of insight, because if we don't, you know, we're like, it's kind of like we're on like a bomb on a train, like we're headed to like a cliff. Like, you know, that might be a little dark, but like, you know, we are the captain of what we are trying to basically accomplish. And if we as a unit collectively just basically throw everything that is aside and just give you the middle finger to the world, then the world isn't going to be very collaborative with what we're trying to do.
Exactly. And that's the biggest it. Like, that, you just nailed it so perfectly. It's like, we, like, you know, the part of freedom is that you also have to help define the rules, right? Like, it's, you know, like, there is like anarchy is not society, right? It's like our ability to structure society and like give ourselves and the broader majority. It's like, it's a great power comes great responsibility. And I think that that's entirely what the ecosystem has like currently at its level, right? Like, we're about to move into a massive cycle and already are. And like, we have to be responsible for like the actions that occur. It's not just like free for alls, because free for alls come with things that we would rather not feel personally. Right. So
yeah, precisely.
You know,
yeah. So you must feel pretty passionate and strong about this idea of owning your identity, owning your data, owning your money, and existing in a world where personal responsibility is at the highest amount, and being able to have this control of kind of what you put into the world and everything that you do. So, you know, how do you take that ideology, and correct me if I'm wrong there, and apply it into Shift and into your forward thinking, right? How do you, you know, take these concepts that the industry shares and actually put them into practice? So I guess what I'm asking is, what are you guys building specifically, right, that, you know, puts these concepts into play?
Yeah, and so like, we looked a lot at this, and like, I think scalability is a big one on like the true idea of like decentralized identity. I think is like there's a lot of, you know, facade, but you have to really break down to like what that means. And like, identity is broad, right? And like, you know, so like, it's not any one thing, right? Like, I am 5 different personas at any one given, you know, destination, right? And so like, really getting into like the granulars are important, right? Like, how do you scale data ownership? again, back to user experience, like custody, like, do we actually have want to have the responsibility of controlling data, right? Like, those are all like big concepts and questions. And you know, a lot of people are lazy. They don't want to have to deal with things like that, right? So I think there's are these realistic trade-offs. For Shift, it was more about like ownership and consent, right? So it's not so much that Shift is acting as this data storage protocol. It's really just acting as a consent and transmission request engine, right? Which is to say, you know, I am Joseph. I know my data is stored in Coinbase or in Binance or wherever it is, and I'm actually the one who's allowing the request and being asked, hey, are you given permission to allow this information to move? And then at the smart contract level, what are the conditions by which that data is being moved, right? Are there data markets that are created on the back of this? If so, how are you accepting payment for that type of data? Or even just simply like, I'm going into a compliance requirement. I have to go and onboard to a new exchange like Coinbase. Like, how do I have more protection and understanding that my data is where it is and that it's only being transferred when I say it's okay to allow that, right? Like, those are, I think, like where we've tried to focus. We've also looked at like compliance is probably an identity in compliance is probably the most important thing to get right, because, you know, identity is so broad. Like, you could argue that, you know, use of DeFi is a form of identity. The data that's collected on chain is a form of identity. And so, you know, trying to solve like the human-centric problem is something that we've really tried to. We've been working on a national identity system as well with the government of Bermuda as kind of an experimentation to say, if we were to bring the first government onto a public network, you know, how would you enable public-private key Ethereum-based addresses to actually form that identity and empowerment system? And so that's a current experimentation happening on Shift as well. But like, I ultimately think that like there's these trade-offs between holding data versus the given rights to control and allow for my use of data. And I think the usage and control and consent is the most important thing today. I think that we'll see more things, but that's kind of the basis, at least for the way that we think about it.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah.
And I think you're on point with the idea as far as the common folk not really caring or not really wanting to take more responsibility. Like how, like, I like would I say that I personally care that Instagram and Facebook and Google have all my information and data? No, I mean, it's pretty convenient, you know, like it's kind of convenient, like you know, like it's fine. But
Yep.
like, is that always how it's going to be? And like, has that perspective been changing over the last few years? Most definitely, especially with
Yep.
politics.
Yep.
You know, with more social media, with more companies and businesses that are realizing, oh, like we can make a lot of money off of information and data, right?
Yep.
And so, yeah, I mean,
Completely.
like that would be really cool to like be able to like go on Facebook or something and be like, okay, like X, Y, and Z after this session has picked up this, and this. Like, is it okay to send this to this person? And then even better, is it okay if we send this to this person, which we are going to make X, Y, and Z amount off of, and here's your cut. Yes, like, you know what I'm
Exactly.
saying? Like,
Yes.
so like something like that
100%.
would be very cool as well.
Yeah, and I think it ultimately is a trade-off. Like, I am okay with Facebook holding my data when I choose them to, and if they're going to pay me for it, that's a trade-off. Like, I may be more comfortable with that, right? Like,
Right.
I would love to see a world where Filecoin, you know, holds all these data points, and, you know, you're writing consent permissioning in and out of Shift, and I have the option to move data from a, you know, a decentralized file storage back to these centralized repositories, or to shard data across everything, right? But I think we're quite a ways away from that, but I think that world is possible, and I think the ecosystem's creating it, and it's super exciting.
Yeah.
But I ultimately think that like people are, again, not always like, we always thought people would always want to control their keys, right? Like, not your keys, not your
Not your
coins.
coins. Yeah.
We have realized that that's just not how most people work, right? Like,
No.
it's just it's there's a small subset of us who like that, and I think that goes the same for data as well. Like, if I can know where it is, if I can monetize my data, if I can be paid for that, that is a very good trade-off. But again, it's all about options. So as long as we give these options and people utilize them, I think that's the most important thing.
Well, I think the outlook that might be a little negative here is that we need some catalysts to get people to want to take these actions. Now, of course, do I want to be hacked for all of my data and then that be like, oh crap, like I should probably take control of this? No, I don't think anybody wants that on any realm. But like, certain things like that is what drives that action. Because I mean, we're not going to act until we have to act effectively. And so,
Very true.
when you lose money on, let's see, what was one of those exchanges on like Ether Delta back in the day, or
Gox or something.
Gox. There you go. And it's like, oh shit, like, maybe I should just get a hardware wallet, because then I'm good, right? But until like you experience that, it's kind of tough to like want to take those actions. I mean, that goes for anything, really. I mean, it goes for when you're squatting, just using the things on the side of the plate so it doesn't fall off, right? Like there's so many things in our lives that until the consequence hits, it's like, oh, okay, we probably don't need to do anything about it. And so bringing it all back kind of to the data and the privacy and stuff. I mean, it's definitely crucial that we have options, but a few catalysts, I think, is all that we're away from people seriously considering, okay, like how can I change how I'm managing my, all of my internet identity and my life online.
Definitely. Yeah. Like, I think that there's like, in my view, there's probably a few core narratives. Like, I think our ecosystem is going to be very powerful in the next 3 to 5 years in enabling those like incentives, right? Like, there is like a very strong incentive to, move into our ecosystem as a financial basis, right? And I think that you can actually look at using a lot of the financial incentives that our ecosystem is developing to like potentially, bring that out of people in certain use cases. I think that's one. I ultimately think regulations is also going to be something that drives people more towards these concepts, right? Like, we've always taken this view that like regulation is almost like it's a protocol, right? It's the same thing as Ethereum.
That's a huge
right?
catalyst.
Like,
That's
it forces these requirements, right? And
it
so
makes
like
people do things.
Exactly. And so like that was kind of the perspective, is like, as regulations force our ecosystem into stuff, we need to be able to respond with infrastructure that actually gives us a better resistant path, but also that like responds to that, right? These are all rules and protocols. It's the same thing. Some of them expressed in technology, other in law. It's the same idea, right?
Yeah, it is the same.
It is like, it's one's in code, the other one's in like paper. But I think that that's like a big thing. And so like, I think, and then the last thing, unfortunately, is like, people will do things once they realize that they're being spied on or they're being hacked. It's just the reality. Like, you're right. People don't respond unless they have to, right? So we really do view this like identity and kind of like question as like, one, being pushed by regulatory adoption will enable ecosystem growth, will enable these new use cases, lead to new capital formation and bringing new use cases in. And then I also think the financial lift that DeFi has and these new primitives will really kind of make it accelerate in a way that we want in the space. So I don't know, that's my hopeful look, I guess, if you can.
And the regulation works in the sense of forcing people within crypto to accommodate the regulatory, institution or state that they live in, right? So, for example, Coinbase has to follow all of the US laws and the SEC and all that stuff, but also works in the opposite sense, in that regulation on the people that aren't in crypto yet per se could bring them in, because let's just say, for example, taxes even, right? Or this new idea of the digital currencies and the state issued digital, coins, whatever it is, right?
Yeah.
So it's like, so now I'm gonna be having to do all my transactions, which I'm doing them all on a debit card already. So I'm already being watched on everything that I do, where I am, exactly where I spend. But now it's on something that is controlled directly by the government, and they have full transparency. And then what if they say, oh, you can only use those in certain places, or certain places and certain things and bills will only accept these? Then that kind of forces people into that idea of like, oh shit, now I'm like, I had no other choice. Okay, but crypto still gives me a different choice, kind of, right?
Exactly. Completely.
So that options, like, it goes both ways.
Both
in
ways.
the regulatory sense.
Yeah, and like I actually said this like a few weeks ago is like we are also kind of the monsters we made, like central bank digital currencies are only here because our ecosystem is growing so quickly, right? Like we've created this like privacy question that does potentially affect billions of people, right? And like it's what makes our ecosystem's growth so important, right? Because like I have no question in my mind that these tools are used for good and they will be used for bad, right? And like you have to make sure that we have systems that people can run to when governments choose to try to use them in negative ways, right? And like there's this
Yeah.
huge balance, but like we already are digital, right? And like as you said, like we use debit cards. Well, there's no like it's not like paper moving around. It's numbers on a screen. So if we can bring more efficiency to those systems, but also give people those privacy opt-out options, I think that that's like the balance that ends up occurring, right? So
Yeah.
completely agree. Yeah.
Yeah. It's pretty nuts, honestly, everything that's happened up to this point. I mean, it seems like you've had like a massive a bird's eye view of kind of just like the growth of the nascency phase. And then, I mean, we're still in the nascency phase, but it's
Yes, we are.
like the really, really nascent phase, and then kind of like here, and then like the ICOs, and then like DeFi, and then like whatever's next. Kind of to wrap us up here
Yeah.
over the next five,
Yeah.
10 minutes, I'd love to just kind of hear like an overarching perspective of like how you've seen things grow, change, and shift. So whether it's the way protocols are building, or token distributions, or the way that the regulations are happening, the way that the relationships with us and the regulatory bodies, or
Yep.
exchanges, hacks, even price appreciation and growth, and ways like just everything. If you could do
Yeah.
like a 5-minute spiel, I suppose, just kind of like what you've seen that's changed over time, and maybe another
Yeah.
extra few minutes on like what you're seeing in the next few years.
Yeah, like as I'll bring it back to like my earlier point. Like I think early on in the space, there was a lot less arguing and it was less aggressive, right? It was more everyone had the equal beliefs, and it wasn't protocol wars and who's arguing who's right. And so I personally loved that moment because Bitcoin and the early workings of Ethereum, like in Toronto, it wasn't this like holy war as it feels like in many respects, right? And ideologies were more, I think, aligned, right? But I think that like growth is a great thing, and I think like price growth and regulatory growth is a good thing. It means that like what we're noticing is like people actually care, right? Like, and when people start to care, they know they can't stop it. Like, and that's like what's so powerful is like the one thing I've always said is like Bitcoin's direction is up to us, and it's like how we choose to allow that to move. Bitcoin will always be here, as we said, like long after you and I are here. Ethereum, Bitcoin, these things will continue to survive. The question is, do we lead them down the paths of darkness, or to things that are usable and until keep them in the light, right? And I think that that's the big battle that we're seeing today. I think that was less prevalent up until about a year or two ago. I think the ICO craze really drove the attention that everyone started to now say, whoa, there's a regulatory and policy question here. But if we can get policy right and we can keep the balance, I think that that's like what is probably the most important thing of the next year and the current year. And I think that that is where everything lies in the balance. Like the discussions in policy right now are like, do you go to ban DeFi or look at banning P2P and privacy? And there's these big arguments in privacy today. And I think that'll really create a huge outcome. Like we have to remember where the ecosystem came from. Like the cypherpunks like fought for privacy laws to ensure that encryption would be something that is not an armament. And in like the early guys and Bitcoin guys were all these early privacy advocates, right? And it's what allowed for the growth of encryption and privacy. And so I think that that'll be this battle that like crypto deals with a lot more as it gets more prevalent. And so, I think like where we are today is this amazing moment where DeFi, I find it to be incredibly interesting because like you're kind of taking a lot of these, traditional concepts, but creating something that actually can be useful to a lot of people. I think the ICO, moment, I love experimentation. And so like, I don't hate on, like, I know a lot of, Bitcoin guys say everything's a scam. I just kind of keep quiet on a lot of it and say everyone's just trying to understand new concepts and new things and let it be. And I think that that's what makes it amazing, is this idea that we can enable innovation and be accepting of innovation. I think that that's where a lot of peers differ. And I kind of try not to comment on one thing in particular. I think that, of course, like the scams have not helped. They have definitely hurt. But it is experimentation, right? And like, unfortunately, we call these things coins, and so regulators care. If we hadn't called them currencies and coins, regulators wouldn't care so much, right? Like, and it's just, we've been terrible at marketing. I also put it that way. Nonetheless, I think that like where we are today is this pivotal intersection where like this institutional adoption is coming because they're realizing that the crazy kids were actually right, and like that's like what I find to be amazing. Like price growth today, you look at it and it's a function of the world saying, whoa, wait a minute, for 10 years these people have been crazy, but actually they're onto something really, really powerful here, right? And that's like something that we should all hold like really high in everyone, like we've been fighting for that moment. It's here. And now the question is, can we grow up fast enough to try to, get to the next phase? Like we grow up with Bitcoin and Ethereum. Like we have to adapt as people in the same way that we lead that technology. And so to kind of, to get to the future, like I think the idea that, compliance opt-in primitives become a reality. I think the idea that more trust is embedded by systems like this becomes really critical to the next phase of growth, as a way to curb, aggressive regulatory over-enforcement. More regulatory-based infrastructure becomes very valuable in the ecosystem, right? There's a price to pay for new types of opt-in systems like that, and I think that's really interesting. And I ultimately think that the future is a mixture between stable coins and new types of credit and lending and capital formation liquidity pools that can actually allow institutions or very large funds or private family offices to play in these liquidity pools. Today, what most people don't realize is the biggest funds, even in crypto, are not able to go into Uniswap. They're not actually able to because they don't know who their user is that they're buying from. They don't know who their counterparty is. People don't realize that there's this counterparty obfuscation is a problem to the largest fund money managers and people with money. So the ability for us to solve that, like I can figure out who someone is within a bound range, that actually enables massive growth in the space. And I think from a lending side, a credit side, those things see enormous growth. And I think the convergence of Bitcoin and Ethereum and everything starts to, it'll never end internally. We'll always have politics, but I think like as we start to see the wider world start to use these services because they're actually important and they help solve problems, like we kind of get over that. There'll always be the holy war. I don't know. I hope to think that there won't be, but that's just the way it goes. But I think that we'll see some incredible things in the next kind of 12 to 24 months that we probably couldn't have imagined in the space, right? And I don't know, it makes me happy. It's like we told you so,
Yeah,
it's hard. Now they join us, right?
Yeah,
so,
exactly.
Yeah.
Seeing the guys on CNBC and stuff is just crazy.
It's
like
amazing.
Billionaires, just like, yeah, man, I have some. That
yeah,
got like they're like slowly accumulating like tens of millions.
Everything.
Like, yeah.
Yeah, right. Like I think it's amazing,
crazy.
right? And I think that I think that infrastructure gets better, and I think that we have an incredibly bright future if we can get regulation on our side.
Yeah,
like that's the big
key.
thing,
It has
that's
to be driven
man.
in a way that is collaborative with like the greater world.
Yeah, exactly. Because it's all about making it safe for users, and degenning into things and getting hacked is like, don't do that, guys.
Yeah,
like,
the rug pull is not the move.
Like,
there's so many bad.
Exactly.
There's bad actors, so it's tough. It's tough when there's bad actors, but there's bad actors everywhere, and somehow we figured that out to some extent in our current system. So it should be a lot easier to do now. Honestly, although it's different, but yeah.
I think that the one thing is also build slow and build well, because you're dealing with people's money, like the throwing smart contracts out that are not, you have to take time.
That DeFi summer was ridiculous.
Right? That's what I mean. It's hey, I know it's exciting, but there's a reason why Bitcoin is slow built. I'm not saying it has to be that same way, but there's a reason for it, right? Correct. So if we can adopt some of these practices, that keeps things more safe, right?
And that speaks to the decentralization of Bitcoin too, because the reason 100%. Why, there's I'm not sure there'll ever be another actual acceptance of a technical creation or improvement on Bitcoin ever again. Now, I can be completely wrong, but it's because there's so many people with so many different ideas and so many people, so many different views that it's just like, no, it's just not going to happen. Like, we just accept it. And like that, that speaks to it. Now, when there's teams that are like, yo, we're shipping products, we're doing this, this, and this. I mean, that's great. Like, that's great. Awesome. But like
100%.
That also speaks to you guys have a team of 8 who have all control and do everything. And then just, it's like, what are you really building here? Right.
I think that there will be a balance, right? Like, I think like, I love the Ethereum velocity, right? Like the speed of innovative growth is like what keeps me like really fascinated. And I think that that's what like is so interesting. So I think like there will be some emergence between both of those, mindsets and practices. And then we'll see these things that are truly, forever lasting. And my hope at least is that, right?
Yeah.
So
it's crazy. Well, Joseph, this was a hell of a time. I think the folks who are still listening, absolute G's for that. And the ones who have heard anything will be extremely appreciative. I'm really glad that we got the time to do this one. This one's going to be a doozy. I appreciate you, brother.
Thanks so much, man. And thanks for having me. And hopefully we'll be back on soon.
Let's do it. All right, buddy.
All right.